Hello again, and welcome to yet another conversation between an author from New Haven Publishing. Today it's a little different because that author is going to be me. And I thought it's not really right for me to ask myself questions because obviously I would know the answers. So I thought it'd be really interesting to bring in somebody who's totally connected to what this new book is about. He doesn't realize that he's totally connected to it, but he is. So I better allow him in and then he can ask me some questions. I'm hoping you're there. Are you there, Mr. Best? Hello, hello, hello. Why, there he is now. But why can't I hear him? I'm hoping he can hear me.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you perfectly. So now, um, yes, we're both on. We're both recording.
Yes, we are. Hang on, let me move this in a place where I'm not looking at you at a strange angle. That might not be possible for some reason. Should I move this over here?
No,
Let's have a look.
you're looking a perfect angle, I must say. Let me just say, because I know that the name Lee Best came up, but you don't look very much like Lee. You look much more
Yes.
like Roag Best, most famous perhaps for running and owning the Liverpool Beatles Museum in Matthew Street,
Yeah.
Liverpool.
Am I still there vocally? Yes, I am.
You are still there
Okay.
vocally.
Okay. Yes. Not there in any other capacity, but most definitely still here vocally. So, should we begin? I
Oh,
have
yeah,
some
let's
questions for
begin.
you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
this is different. This is strange for me, anyway. But
Yes, yes. Me interviewing you rather than you interviewing me.
yeah,
Yeah.
quite.
Okay, well, first question, Tim.
Yeah,
Bigger than the Beatles. What on earth is that supposed to mean?
yeah. Thank you for the question. And it is a strange thing for me to ask you to ask that question, really, as you run the Beatles museum. Bigger than the Beatles. Well, kind of. You know what? You inspired it. Not you personally, but your museum. It's a few years ago now that I started writing this book, and it came after I was walking around your museum, and there was a particular item on display there. It was a little Beatles flick book or flip book from 1963. And like so many of the exhibits at the museum, it took me back completely. And it was something I hadn't seen since 63. It was a fold out book of John Paul George Ring. And I remember actually buying it myself at a railway station, Blundell Sands and Crosby, little suburb of Liverpool. And I remember the joy it gave me because it was 1963, one of the first bits, I imagine, of Beatles memorabilia out there, merchandise at that time. And it was fabulous black and white photos of the band. So when I came away from the museum that day, it was as though I was back in 63. And so many memories started coming together. I remembered buying my first guitar because everybody bought a guitar in 1963, especially in Liverpool. I was 9.5 years of age. I also bought a book to go with it called Playing a Day by a guy called Bert Whedon, which seemed a great way to learn playing a day. The trouble was, Bert, you did not stipulate which day it would be that I would finally play the bloody thing. So it never came to pass. But that guitar is still in my office here. I'm ever hopeful. But I fear the worst because I have no sense of rhythm. And I think that's kind of essential. You might know as a drummer. Do you think I could get by with absolutely zero rhythm in any way
Well,
as a musician? I think it's a sort of must. You
yeah.
have to be born with that, I suspect. You
Well,
can't.
having no rhythm doesn't seem to stop people nowadays.
No, well said. Ah, yes. And now that actually, again, is the reason why this book came about, because of nowadays. It's because of nowadays and yesterdays. It set in motion a thought. I wanted to write a book about those days because, my gosh, to grow up in Liverpool at that time was wonderful, because it hadn't been wonderful until that explosion in '63, a beautiful explosion. And suddenly you realized, even as a school kid, that, you know what, life was actually for having fun, thanks to, well, not only the Beatles, but, you know, the 300 other bands that were knocking around Liverpool at the time. And they were all these young people, but they were having a blast. Whereas my school had insisted that, no, 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 the thing you've got to look forward to is dying. And then you'll go to one of three places. You'll go to limbo, purgatory, or hell. There was no talk of heaven at St. Mary's College in Crosby back then. So that's what I'd been, that's my direction. That was my direction as a 9-year-old until I heard Please Please Me on the radio. And that changed everything. I thought, well, who do I follow? These ghastly old Christian brothers, or these four guys who already had an amazing history behind them. So huge, huge impact, and the ripple effect that continues to this day. I mean, it's why I've got this ridiculous haircut. It's why I'm sitting in a room with posters relating to things that happened long, long ago. The impact is constant and continuing. And I thought, yeah, I've got to write about, I want to write a book about that period, try and capture it, but how best to do it? And you may know, Roag, you may be aware that Jane and I, my darling wife and I, we had formed a management company for artists many, many years ago. And we ran it very successfully, if I say so myself, in most cases. There were a couple of cases where it was not successful, but we don't talk about those. But on the whole, it was incredibly successful, considering we both had no natural rhythm, but we did know music, and we loved and adored music and musicians, or most of them. And one of the artists that we represented during that time was somebody that Jane had fallen in love with back in 1965, when she was 15 and he was a little older, and he'd come over to the States. He was an Englishman, very, very English. He went over to the US, and in the States, he said, look, I'm here and I'm English. This was in 1960. Well, he arrived in '64. By 1965, he was having hit after hit after hit because he was English and he was in America at the right time. And he was fantastic. Jane loved him dearly. And
what was the artist in question? Who was this man having?
Well, I'm not going to say his name because I've taken liberties with him slightly in this book. But he's the guy who inspired us, or inspired me. And I thought, yeah. And the reason he inspired me was this. We brought him over to do a tour of the UK. He'd lived in the States all the time since since 1964. And we brought him back here to do a short tour of the UK. And by now he was in his 60s, and we were walking with him towards BBC Broadcasting House in up at the top of Regent Street in London. And it was a very noisy day. There was noise coming from shops. There was garish shop window displays. And London was his hometown, and he was looking at it all. And we could see that he was getting more and more down. And then he stopped and he said these magical words. He said, I just hate. And then he thought for a moment before saying, everything. And we both laughed out loud because it was such a dramatic statement. And it was only as years went on that we realized the beauty of that statement, it was a fantastic statement. It was something that we would say to each other regularly whenever we saw, I don't know, some hideous news event featuring a politician or whatever. And Jane and I would just turn to each other and say, you know, I just hate, always with a pause, everything. And
So
so,
your main character at this point is 60 years old. I've just made another note here. Is 60 years old, and the second line says jaded.
yeah,
So
yes,
please continue.
yeah, jaded indeed. Well, that's the word. So I started thinking, okay, I want to write a book about those glory years, but how interesting would it be to make it the autobiography of a guy who was there right at the start? And I want him to be Liverpudlian. Don't want him to be from London. I want him to be from Liverpudlian, Liverpool even. And I want to follow his life all the way through. And I want to leap backwards and forwards as he's writing this book, because he doesn't really want to write it, because he's got better things to do with his time, but he's done this deal with a publisher. You know how it goes. And so he starts off, and the publisher's telling him, oh, try and do this, try and do that. What about this? And he's writing. He's getting older and older as he's writing the book. And we keep leaping from his earliest musical memory, which is 1957, when he's with a mate in his kitchen and the TV's on and he hears Lonnie Donegan for the first time. And as he says, his life changed at that moment. And he, in turn, picked up a guitar, and he, unlike myself, did have natural rhythm. And so we follow him from that moment, and then he'll suddenly have a memory from today. So he'll be writing that down. And he's about to set off, because it's now the present day. So he's now actually in his 80s. And he's about to set off, thanks to his agent, on what he's calling the death toll, because he knows this is the last thing he's going to do. And then we leap back and we follow the musical history of him and his band. The beautiful thing is, to begin with, they flop time and time again. They can't do what the Beatles eventually did, because even the Beatles didn't make it just like that. That was how many years of hard work, as you know only too well. And so I thought, well, those are really interesting years, those years of the slog where you're attempting to get there and you think you're about to make it, and then you're back to square one almost. So we follow that, but then suddenly there is a breakthrough. And by now he's got a band round him, and his band is called the Dream Daffodils, because it's a 60s band. And we're heading into 66, 67, when, I don't know about you, but I do recall myself at that time, and I did have flowers in my hair, and I wore trousers, one leg satin, which was bright green, and the other leg was burgundy. And I looked wonderful in my head. But I did not look wonderful. Bear in mind, I was growing up in Liverpool. I did not look wonderful to lorry drivers who would drive past and feel impelled to stop their lorries and come back and comment on my appearance, because I had the long hair as well. So it was a strange time to be in Liverpool, which one of the reasons it became famous was because of hair. But there was still a lot of angry people in Liverpool who didn't like people who had long hair. So anyway, back to the book. We follow Mike Simon, is the name of the main character, as not only does his band succeed, but as it says on the tin, they become bigger than the Beatles. That be Mike there. And there is a striking resemblance between the two of us.
You could actually take yourself and Mike for twins. The resemblance is so close.
Yeah, but you know what it is, really? It's just the hair. It's the hair and the Liverpool hair,
Yeah.
which is curly. You know, that's kind of a typical Liverpool head. And also the reason really for the hair is because I think a lot of people suffer from this. I don't think you do, actually. but they have big ears, sticky out ears. George Harrison had extraordinary sticky out ears, which we never saw once the hair grew. So that's part of the reason that hair was so important to us. Indeed, I did an interview with Jürgen Vollmer once, who was the guy who cut John and Paul's hair into the famous Beatles cut. And I remember him saying, yes, 1963, it was not the music, it was the hair that made them. It was the hair. And while he was joking to a certain extent, there was a lot of truth in that. And I remember myself, 1963, immediately wanting that look, attempting to get that look, and being sent home from school in May 1963 with a letter saying Beatle haircuts are not allowed at St. Mary's College.
Did the hair also contribute to the Daffodils' success?
Well, yes, it did, because I mean, by the time they do actually hit the heights, before that, we follow them as they're playing the little clubs around Liverpool, and indeed the little churches, like the Jive Hive in Crosby, which was big. And really, it was at the Jive Hive that things changed because of something they did that night. They were ready to pack it in. They thought it's not going anywhere. We've been at this stage for so many years now, and then they did something on stage that night that hit the headlines. And I won't say what that is because it's shocking and it should not be talked about until after the watershed at 9 o'clock. So anybody who buys this book, please do not read it until after the watershed at 9 o'clock. Otherwise, you'll be shocked. But you'll be fine after 9 o'clock because that's how it works. So, yeah, the stories leap backwards and forwards through time. The Dream Daffodils were a big part of Live Aid. You might remember if you tuned into that. I'm sure you did. They were over in Philadelphia, but key moments in pop history are chronicled in this book as they ride that roller coaster of success.
Well, if I remember rightly, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Tim, but my recollections of Live Aid, they pretty much stole the day, which was quite unexpected.
I think you might have read one of the fan magazines produced by the Dream Daffodils at the time, which indeed was very much pushing that line.
I see.
It helped that following them at Live Aid was Bob Dylan with Keith Richards and Ronnie Wood. And that trio of legends did what has gone down in history as their worst performance ever, which I remember watching at the time and thinking, there's a story behind this. Without a doubt, there has to be a story about why they are so god awful tonight. And indeed there is. And stories such as that do pop up in this book. They're also there nearer to home. Earlier on in 1963, Brian Epstein invites them to be the musical accompaniment to Paul McCartney's 21st birthday party at Auntie Gin's. So that's kind of, there's legends have grown around that party, mainly because of John's behavior there. And the book reveals a few details about that very day, which even as the writer, I found fascinating when I read it. Because the book did in many ways write itself. Once I had the characters in place, I know that timeline so well because I've lived through it myself and been fascinated by it. And also because of when Jane and I were running our music management company and we were working with some of the biggest names in pop and rock, the highlight for me and Jane was always after the shows were great, because sometimes there will be moments where, bloody hell, just getting a show on is not, it's not just a question of just all turn up there at the right time and get on stage. There's all sorts that goes into it. And there would be moments when this is quite a slog, but always on the night, it was wonderful. And, you know, we had the best seats in the house, sort of stage left, just watching the show. But even better than the show was after the show, when there would be certain amounts of booze around and stories would start to be told from some of these wonderful artists. And of course, those stories can never be repeated because that would be highly unprofessional. But at the same time, I felt that they needed recording in some way with names changed. So a lot of those stories do pop up, but with names changed slightly to protect, I was going to say the innocent, but to protect the far from innocent in this book. So I'm very happy. I mean, anybody who was there at the time would not be offended by
the main character. The main character, is he a villain or a hero of his story?
Yeah, it's a good. Well, you know, I look at you. I look at your name, Roag. You know, and it's
Well, it's actually Lee today for some reason.
well, it's Lee today. Whatever. We're living in a very gender-free time now, so it's only right.
If I want to identify as Lee, you know,
or a supervillain, a hero supervillain. I mean, I know in my own life, I've been both hero and villain. You know, if I'm honest about myself, totally hero and villain. As I look back over 71 years, it's like you could have done that better, or you know, you couldn't have done that worse in some cases. So he's that, and some people would frown at them. You know, it always makes me laugh when the media gets hold of stories about people in the public eye and act as if they're shocked by certain behavior, instead of recognizing that no, this is just a human being plodding through life and attempting to get from A to B. But the media, of course, is all about making things shocking. They need that. They need their papers to. They need the public to be shockable still, so that they'll pick up the
Is the majority of the book based in the 60s, 70s, 80s? Where's the majority of the book placed?
It's everywhere that music was. So I have to say, yeah, I do have a particular fondness for the 60s. And a kind of fondness for the 50s too, because it was so different to the 60s. And so my memories of that, even though I was very young at the time, are, you know, vivid. I do remember the first time I heard skiffle. I do remember the first time I heard rock and roll coming out of our little wireless. And it made you stop. It stopped you in your tracks. And then, of course, the big thing was come 1963, January, and hearing "Please Please Me" on the radio for the first time. And that did literally stop me in my tracks. And all life changed at that moment. And that's no exaggeration. So, you know, as for him being a hero or villain, yeah, the answer is yes, he's hero and villain.
With regards to the Dream Daffodils, and you mentioned these recollections, backstage situations, tall stories or war stories being exchanged, these situations that have been woven into the character and the band. And I was speaking to an artist a couple of weeks ago, and he said everything changed around 1982, 83. He said we all had to change our behaviour backstage, private areas, etc., etc. And I said, why? What happened in 82, 83? He said the mobile phone with a camera on it. He said everyone had to change their behaviour. Yeah.
Yeah.
Was it like that for the Daffodils?
No, no, they because they're from Liverpool, and so by that time there was no changing them. They're not going to change their behaviour because and consequently there were problems that would arise. and indeed huge problems that arise by the end of the book for them, because they are living in this new world, which is
Yeah.
a far cry from 1957 and indeed 1963. It's not, the people used to say that the past is a different world. Um, it's not, it's a different universe, a completely different universe. And so it is in this book. And that's one of the things that I enjoyed most in the writing of it. Having this main character um, have to go through those changes of the world, the way the world has changed, how there was so much hope and joy and delight back at that time, and how by now he has indeed become this man who looks out at the world and all the things happening in his life, and repeatedly says the words, I just hate everything.
With all that said and done and taken into consideration, how difficult was the book to write?
Yeah, it was difficult. The ending was difficult. And in fact, I about a year ago, I thought, well, I'm not gonna finish this book because I can't. I didn't want there to be a typical ending, of him. Now he's old, and that's it. I didn't want that because that would be so wrong, considering his impact on the world. It needed to be something else, but it needed to connect with the modern day. And back in last November, I was approached by my publisher, a wonderful woman called Teddy, Norwegian, um, with New Haven Publishing. And she said, I want a Tim Quinn book for next year. And I said, well, I do have this idea that I've been working on. And she immediately said, yeah, we'll go with that. She said, but I need it by January. So there's nothing like a deadline. You might be aware there's nothing like a deadline, because you know what, you can have a deadline 5 years from now, and guess what? You'll start finishing it a month before the 5 years is out. So this was great. And then a news story actually hit the headlines. A few days after I'd had this conversation with my publisher, and I thought, there it is. That's the story. That's how the story ends. So it brought it right up to date. It brought it right up to date. It was a news story, a huge media explosion. And I thought, that's the perfect ending for this story. So the timing was great. It's all in the timing. Oh, drummer, as you know. And that's finally I got the ending. So it's very strange in in writing. People often say, well, where do ideas come from? You got me. I have no idea where ideas come from. I know that I used to moan a bit to Jane if ideas weren't flowing, and she would always look heavenwards and say, oh, for goodness sake, you do this every time. Just go for a walk, or go and do something, do this, do that, and then it'll come. And absolutely, she's completely right every time. And I'd come in from a walk, or come in from doing something in the garden, or reading a book or whatever, and I've got it. She said, well, of course you have, because that's how it works. And it's a very strange thing, where we pull those ideas from, whether they're songs or whatever. Not that I've written a song until now, until now, because I have a lovely friend in a band who are regulars at the Cavern, and I bumped into them at the weekend and was telling them about the book, and then they did the decent thing and went online and bought the Kindle version, and they started reading it, and they said, hey, are you doing a talking book of this? And I said, well, funny enough, I've just been asked by the publisher to do a talking book. Right, well, what about having musical interludes in it? Because in the book, I mentioned some of the hits of the Dream Daffodils. And they said, we like the title of this song that you mentioned. And immediately this guy starts plonking around his guitar and singing this song. Well, now for somebody with no natural rhythm, and I've always put musicians on a pedestal because it's such an amazing
So
gift.
he'd obviously bought the record at some time and was able to just,
Well, quite.
whack out a bygone tune,
Well, exactly that. I like that. I like that. That's very much my thinking. And when I said that, before, that the book did write itself, I do feel that about it. Once the characters were in place, it was almost obvious. But no, not obvious, but I was surprised by what I was putting down on the page because it was real. It felt as if it was there. This isn't me bigging myself up, because the act of writing has always taken me by surprise. Um, in what ends up on the page. And I often think, well, where'd that come from? How did that happen? But this book in particular, I can say that now, having a few months since I finished it, I pick it up and I'm like, I don't even remember writing this bit or that bit. So the songs will now be, or sort of little excerpts from the songs will be part of the talking book as well, which will bring the Dream Daffodils to life as never before. And I'm really happy with that. It adds to the creative process, if that doesn't sound too poncy. Um,
Yeah, well, maybe it's even an idea for the Dream Daffodils to go into studio and bring those songs into the modern age.
well,
Put a
I,
nice
I,
modern twist on them.
I love the idea of that. Yeah, they could become a Dream Daffodil tribute act,
Yeah.
which would be perfect, because the Dream Daffodils, it has to be said, every member of them absolutely loathed every tribute act on the planet. This is one thing. As original 1960s artists, they of course loathed these bastards who were getting the gigs later on, and this relates to when Jane and I, one of our artists who I can name, Julie Felix, big name in the 60s. And when we first signed her up and we were putting her on tour of the UK, I would get young programmers in venues say to me, well, who's she then? Who is she? Because they hadn't been there in the 60s. Well, to me, that's unforgivable. It doesn't matter if you were there or not. If you're in that job, you should know your music right back to the 1880s pop songs, But there were a lot of these nitwits who you had to get beyond. And I remember one of them saying, oh, well, yeah, we've got bigger names. I said, oh, who've you got? Oh, we got the Beatles here next week. Well, this was in 1998. So he didn't have the Beatles there, but he had some poxy Beatles tribute act there the following week. But here's me moaning. Of course, that poxy tribute act filled the venue. So that would be his excuse for his ignorance, if you like. So of course the band has a natural sort of dislike of tribute acts, because, as I found, they were taking the place of the original artists in many cases, when Jane and I were putting these wonderful artists out on display again.
With regards to the book, Tim, would you like to see it become a film, a TV show?
Yeah, I think it's very naturally so. I think it was interesting that um, the band that picked the book up and started reading it, they immediately got into it and immediately wanted to make the music come to life. So that was kind of interesting. And I do think that the characters are all there. The period, I think, has great interest for so many people globally. The whole Liverpool scene of the 50s and then into the 60s is fascinating. They do come back to Liverpool, because, and you'll be surprised to hear this, they actually have a museum open to them, and they have statues erected in their honor. I won't tell you what happens to the statues,
Well, that's the
or
statues.
indeed the place that the statues are put. Again, that's part of the book. This is something that they should have thought about before agreeing to having statues placed. They should have asked that vital question, well, where are you going to put them? But the book tells all. So yeah, it is very visual book. I mean, as you know, I worked in comic books for many years for Marvel Comics and other publishers. So I do tend to write visually. And I do, as I flick through the book now, I see these scenes do come to life. And I think it would be a fascinating experiment for a production company to try and capture those periods in music from 1957 to 62, 63, the Garden Fate era, through and the difference from that to 67, when things start going crazy, sort of, really. And then on through Live Aid. You know, if you look at Live Aid now, it's fascinating. The big hair, the Brian May look on just about every head. And then on to the present day and the difference here. So I think that would be visually really interesting for any TV or movie production.
How would
It's fun.
you?
It's funny. I have to stress, it is funny, but it's a Liverpool humor. You know, that was one of the things with the Beatles. Okay, it was the hair, yes, the music, without doubt, but they were so funny. They were just naturally funny. You know, this was not scripts. This was just off the cuff stuff. That in '63 was like no other band before. You know, but it was so Liverpool. It was so totally Liverpool.
And with the Daffodils, do you feel that their music transcended these periods in time? Did they stay one step ahead? Did they slip behind?
Uh, you wouldn't mistake their current work for Taylor Swift or any of the other big artists who are out today. You would still recognize it as Daffodil music. You know, so they have something at their core that is still hitting the audience of today. It's so yeah, they were successful through that whole period, which again is an amazing thing, because I think the majority, and this isn't knocking them at all, the majority of artists had that 3 year period. Okay, you've got 3 years of hits now, and then you kind of disappear. And that's an amazing achievement. So yeah, they did good, sort of.
Well, it'd be nice to do something around the book at some point, and maybe a Dream Daffodils tribute, doing 3 or 4 numbers. You know, it's all food for thought.
Well, I can think of no better place than the Liverpool Beatles Museum to do such a thing. So I suggest to anybody listening in, stay tuned to the Liverpool Beatles Museum. Get out there, the one in Matthew Street, and stay tuned to New Haven Publishing. And I see I have less than a minute to do. It's Tim Quinn, and it's Bigger Than The Beatles. I mean, it's dreadful, isn't it? That how can I be so pushy? Roag best, as always, an absolute delight. Thank you
Tim,
so
just
much.
to finish, one thing we haven't touched upon: where can
Oh,
the
everywhere,
people get the book?
everywhere. Amazon, even Amazon. But any good bookshop. Tim Quinn, Bigger Than The Beatles. Buy the book in any shape